welcome back to the channel. We are this time reviewing Liliana of the Dark Realms, brand new Planeswalker from the Duskmourn set. I know they're not necessarily tied to the sets, especially with the way that Webcore's been making them these days. They're pretty independent of set mechanics, which I love. And yeah, let's talk about the latest Liliana, the 10th Liliana in this game. It's hard to keep track of them all. I know that everybody tries to come up with nicknames for them. I like, because it's horror themed, this whole set, Lily Duval, because she kind of reminds me of Shelley Duvall in her face. Anyone with me with that? Anyone? No? Just me? Alright. Well, some of these I come up with for myself, but we could just move on. Let's talk about her stats first. 115 mana, pretty respectable. She's got a passive, and her mana bonuses are that new stair step type of mana bonus that we've been getting. Usually for dual color walkers, though. I don't know if there's a lot of monocolor walkers who have this same type of mana spread, but as we'll get to later, we do get to pump up her mana bonuses pretty much infinitely. So that's definitely one of the main appeals of her. But we'll talk about that when we get to her third ability. So let's start with the deck limits here. 7 creatures, 7 spells, 5 supports. I wish that you got more supports with her. Even a 6th slot would be great. With mono black, I don't play that many creatures, and I'm not usually putting a ton of spells in the deck either, so it is one of her small weaknesses. I wouldn't say it's like a deal breaker or anything, but it's just one of those things that I just wish it had a little bit more versatility in that way. Not the biggest deal. Alright, her abilities. Ability 1. 6 loyalty. Destroy the top 6 cards of your library. If the creature card was destroyed this way, convert 5 gems to black. So this is a pretty good ability. You can either really lean into the library destruction for pulling things out of the graveyard. That's usually a strength of black, and so her ability here helps facilitate that, so we do like that. If a creature was destroyed this way, convert 5 gems to black. So you definitely want to play her with creatures. I would say at least 3 in the deck to really get the most out of it. If you're looking for extra gem conversion, this can really help in the beginning to help set things up. But depending on what you're doing, you might want to save your loyalty for the third ability. But it is a very good ability. I think that it can really help swing things in your favor if you're just really trying to get things in the yard to do things with, and to convert those 5 gems to black can really help get the cards you want on the board. So there are ideas for what you can do with all those black gems. I have to say, though, I haven't really explored them all yet. I'm pretty new to playing with her really intensely, but I do like her a lot. So I think that this ability has more potential that I haven't even tapped yet. Dark Consumption. Ability 2, 9 loyalty. Target creature gets -X/-X. X equals half the amount of black gems on the board rounded down. If that creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control. As just targeted removal, it's not great. I'm not a big fan of -X/-X in most cases, because a lot of times it just isn't enough that it debuffs per use, and this ability is no exception. Half the amount of black gems on the board rounded down. So if you think about it, there are a total of 49 gems on the board total, and there's just no way that every gem on the board is going to be black, because that would just create a bunch of matches on their own. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that we can only have about 24 gems at a time. So that's a -12, -12 at max. But it's really hardly ever going to be that. So most of the time, I think you're only going to be getting a debuff of like -4 to -6 at the most. And that's usually not enough to deal with things like Rakdos and things like that. But also, let's talk about the last part of this ability, which is probably the most crucial part of it. If that creature dies, return it to the battlefield under your control. So, this is a very situational ability in terms of trying to maximize it for the best effect. I would say if your opponent is playing something like a Cruel Whipcracker or a Healer of the Pride, or even like Loot the Key to Everything, something like that, if you're able to steal it from them and put it on your side of the board, there are some pretty low cost creatures that can have pretty strong effects tied to them. So that is the only reason I really use this ability. If I want to sit there and do the math and count up all the black gems on the board and calculate it and maybe steal something that is larger, but that hardly ever happens for me. I have a better solution for stealing cards in black that we'll get to when I talk about the decks. So sit tight for that. And I'll just say that this ability is far too niche to get a lot of use out of. Shadow Triumph. Ability 3, 15 loyalty. This is where you're going to get the most juice out of her. So your black mana bonus is increased by 4 permanently. No until your next turn, no until your next 3 turns. It's just increased by 4 forever. If your black mana bonus is 12 or more, destroy all opposing cards. So that's great. So independent of any other card, if you use this ability twice in a game, your black mana bonus should be at 12. And so that means every time you use a third ability then and after that, you're going to be able to just wipe out your opponent's cards. That is awesome. 2 really great abilities rolled into one. So I think that this ability really opens up the creativity with this walker. It makes things a lot easier to cast as long as you're able to get there in pretty quickly and consistently. And I'll show you how I do it. But yeah, once you're able to really pump up her mana bonus, it's going to be so easy to cast a lot of your hand, which opens up its own set of problems that you might not be thinking of. But I'll talk about that when we get into deck building too. Siphoning the Darkness is her passive ability. This is a great passive ability too. At the beginning of your turn, if there are 2 or more creature cards in your graveyard, gain X mana. X is the number of black gems on the board. So depending on what you're playing, you might have a lot of black gems on the board. And if you're spamming her first ability or otherwise adding a lot of cards into your graveyard, you can do a lot with this ability. You can gain a lot of mana with this passive. I think the most I've ever gotten is 17, which is pretty good. For not having to do anything except put 2 creatures in your graveyard, that's fantastic. So I really like this passive. Something you don't even have to think about. You just get mana seemingly out of nowhere. You're like, how'd that happen? And you look at your graveyard and go, oh, that's how. So I really like that. Now let's talk about the pros and cons. So I think her biggest pro is the scalable mana gains in black. And not far behind that is a great passive ability. They do take a little bit of building around for both of them, but not that much. A built-in board wipe for relatively cheap, 15 loyalty, well, really 30 loyalty if you count the 2 times that you need to activate this ability. The ability to keep just not only increasing your mana bonuses, but wiping your opponent's side of the board really helps a lot with controlling the board. And if you're able to do that, you're pretty much cruising to victory. Yeah, and their suite of abilities allow for a lot of deck variety. There's only a few very small restrictions that shouldn't get in the way of most people playing mono black. You do want to play creatures to get the max out of her abilities, and most likely you want something to speed track your way to lots of loyalty. Those are pretty soft suggestions for deck building around her. Other than that, you can pretty much do whatever you want with her as far as mono black goes. And so that brings me to the cons. There is one that I forgot here, but I'll touch on it here. Mono black. It's really not the best color in the current meta. I would say that it has the least amount of utility cards right now. But that means, she might be a really good legacy walker for you if you're looking for one. And, she does hold her own in standard as long as you are happy with building for mono black. And her second ability is hugely limited in its effectiveness. I already talked about why I think so, but it really is the weakest point in her kit. I wish that the restriction on the amount that you can debuff a creature wasn't so large, but that's a pretty small nitpick on her. The other con that I should have added in here is that she really needs to have cards that draw for her, and that's another thing with mono black that's not really great right now. There's not a lot of good draw cards. Black just doesn't always have a lot of great draw in standard anyway, so you might look to colorless options for that there. Elhammeret's Archive. I'll show you what I did pretty soon here. But yeah, those are my main cons with her. And now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the decks that I built for her. Okay, so this deck is mainly built around Satoru and Judith. So one of the things I noticed when I was using Liliana is that she lacks for card draw. So you want cards in your deck that will help you with that. So for this deck, Satoru is going to be the main thing filling up our hand here. So when a creature enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Then if that card has plot, that card gains half its mana rounded down, otherwise gain 4 mana. So none of the cards in this deck have plot. So we're always going to gain 4 mana. It's always 4 mana to the first card in your hand. That is very relevant, though it's not the only reason we use him. It's just a really good side benefit for having him in your deck. And we're going to be trying to cast spells because what we're going to be doing is using Judith Carnage Connoisseur to create creatures to trigger Satoru. So when he casts a spell, create 4 red devil tokens, and your creatures gain death touch and lifelink until end of turn. So what does that mean? It means every time we cast a spell, as long as there's room in our hand, we will draw a card and gain 4 mana for doing so. So we got some pretty interesting spells in here. Some of these are really just to help facilitate things. Leyline of the Guild Pact, going to give us a lot of black gems if we have it on the board, but a lot of times I'm using this for the overflow. Destroy all gems of your opponent's Planeswalker's color, so that especially when we're playing against a non-black walker, that's going to really help clear the board and hopefully leave a lot of black mana gems in its place. So that is why I'm using that. Cryptics, it just really helps to get things going. Converting 5 gems to one of the colors of your greatest mana bonuses, and that's going to be black, of course. When this support is destroyed or loses a reinforcement, draw a card. I never pay attention to that part of the card, but it is another way to get some cards in your hand. Also, when you collect evidence, investigate. There aren't any other cards that really investigate in here, so it's not really going to be relevant for us in this one, but it's really just there to help get things moving in the early game. Ripples of Undeath. This is an amazing card that everybody playing mono black, or really most black walkers, should really try and chase, because it's so good for helping to get us to our loyalty abilities. Because at the end of your turn, destroy the first 7 cards of your opponent's library, then draw a card. So we're getting some more card draw there. But mill 20 at the beginning of your turn, gain 10 loyalty. So most of the time, if you're getting enough cards in your opponent's graveyard, you're just going to be really fast tracking your way to her third ability. You're going to be there pretty quickly. So I like playing Cryptex into Ripples of Undeath as my first 2 cards I play, and then just letting that carry me through to getting the rest of my deck going. So this is one of those things about mono black right now. There aren't a ton of great spells in black if we're not counting removal, but there are some cards that we can try here that have a lot of utility. In this case, we're using a lot of removal, but Russia Dread is one of those cards that's a great all-star utility card. Does a lot of cool things for you. Spree 1, your opponent discards the first 2 cards from their hand, so that should help you with tempo. Spree 2, destroy the first and last opposing creatures, so that's control. And then Spree 4, your opponent loses X life. X is the number of cards in your opponent's graveyard. I haven't found Spree 4 to be super reliable in this deck, but it helps sometimes when I hit that Spree 4 and it's later on in the match, so there are a lot more things in the graveyard, especially after having Ripples of Undeath on the board for long enough. But yeah, this can hit for a lot depending on what your situation is. But I'm really mostly playing it for the Spree 1 and 2. Come Back Wrong is a brand new spell that's actually really cool. So destroy target creature. You can destroy one of your own or your opponent. Then return the last creature from target graveyard to the battlefield under your control. That creature gains finality. I really like this card. It can do a lot for you. I mostly use it to destroy my opponent's creatures, and it's great when I'm able to steal it from them. So I think that this is a better play than using a second ability because it's just more reliable in that regard. So it is a really cool card. And yeah, I recommend you look out for it as you're collecting this set. Sunken Citadel, gonna boost our mana bonuses, but it only boosts by 2. If it boosted by 4, then that would get you to her third ability being a board wipe even quicker. But it is cool to be able to boost up your mana bonuses across the board. Yeah, this one is mainly to help convert gems, and hopefully you'll be converting gems to black, but not always. Either way, it helps to create a lot of cascades that will hopefully ramp you into her abilities a little bit quicker, or just, help get you mana to cards in your hand. Legions to Ashes. This is just a good card for mono black because it can hit supports. And right now in this deck, I'm not using Demolition Field because it's more important that I have more spells in my deck. So I'm looking for black spells that will get me that will remove supports in a reliable way. So exile each opposing non-emblem token support. If you can't, exile an opposing token creature with the greatest number of reinforcements. If you can't, exile an opposing card at random. So the best thing to do here is first play your other removal spells, which will clear out all the creatures, and then it will hit some of the other supports on the board. And the first part of this card is going to be exiling all the tokens so they don't get to benefit from them being destroyed. And then once that's been cleared out, then you can just pick off their other stronger supports with it. And then the last card is a little bit of a flex card. It was really hard for me to decide on what card to use, but the ones that I was using before, they weren't doing enough to help me win the battle. And problem with today's meta is if you don't win the battle fast, you really set yourself up for losing quickly, especially if you're facing Grist. So you can really go with a lot of different things here. Even Rakdos is a fine addition here. But I went with Rottenmouth Viper because the damage that you deal to your opponent stacks as you go. So if you're at the point where you can do a little bit of looping with this deck, that you might be able to cast a bunch of Rottenmouth Vipers in the same turn, which will in turn really build up that level and will really start to pile on damage. So this has been a pretty effective win con for me, actually. And yeah, you can really go with whatever you want here, but that's just the one that I went with for this showcase. So that is how this deck works, and I will show you the next one that I really like. All right, this next deck is really focused more on her first ability because we're going to be putting a lot of things in the graveyard as much as possible and then bringing them out with some of the cards that we have here. Let's start with that first. So the way that we're going to be putting cards into our graveyard is, of course, with Ripples of Undeath. Will get us a bunch of loyalty so that we can spam that first ability and hopefully create a lot of black gems in the process. Also, I'm using Nashi Searcher in the Dark as one of the other main ways to put a lot of cards into my graveyard. You know, you don't necessarily have to use Nashi. Any creature that will continuously destroy your library works great. The reason I like this one is that it scales because it destroys the top X cards of your library, and X is equal to this creature's power. So all you gotta do is kind of pump her up in whatever way you want to do that. Then you may fetch the first enchantment card from your graveyard. If you don't, this creature gets +2/+2. Most of the time I'm going for that buff because I want to get this creature as large as possible so that we're destroying as many things in our library, so that we're destroying as many cards in our library as possible, and therefore able to pull them out with cards like Archpriest of Shadows. When this creature enters the battlefield, target creature gets +1/+1. If that target is not this creature, it gets Death Touch until end of turn. When a creature you control with Death Touch deals combat damage to your opponent's Planeswalker, pick one of the top 4 non-spell cards from your graveyard and move that card into play under your control. So basically, when you get Archpriest of Shadows down and you're giving Death Touch to all your other creatures, you're going to be able to pull out so much stuff and put it into play for nothing. Things like Sunken Citadel. Choose it and blow up the board with gem conversion. Other things like Demolition Field, Ripples of Undeath are just great to have on the board. Just like everything else in here. Cryptex, also very good, of course. And then Chimil, the Inner Sun. In this deck, it's what I'm using for card advantage here. Because at the end of my turn, I get to choose the next 2 cards that are going to be in my hand. And they're going to have half their mana in them because of the Discover 4. That's great. And then at the beginning of your next turn, you're probably going to have creatures in your graveyard, which means that you're going to be able to put mana back into the cards that are still in your hand, and that's just really going to be helping to get things going in your deck. It's really easy once it sets up to just continuously put tons of things on the board and just cruise to victory with cards like Rakdos wiping things out. Live or Die. I showcased this card in my Satoru review, but it works really great here too. You may destroy the first opposing creature. If you don't, return the first creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. At 14 mana, it's usually a little expensive, but when we're pumping up our mana bonuses, it really isn't that difficult to cast, so it's pretty great. The fact that you can get 2 very separate choices from this card makes it really versatile and kind of a staple in black decks right now, I would say. Oh yeah, it's untargeted removal and it's graveyard recursion. So 2 great effects in 1 card. Awesome uncommon. And then the other card that I really like in this deck is Rite of the Moth. Pick 2 of the first 4 creature cards from your graveyard. Put those cards into play under your control. Then those cards gain Death Touch, Lifelink, and Finality. So there's that Death Touch. In case your Archpriest hasn't given Death Touch to your other creatures yet, is a great way to put it on there. And it's forever too. It's a permanent effect. Also with Lifelink. Finality is, the only slight downside, but it's not a big deal. Especially when you're putting so many things into your graveyard, you're probably going to have a copy of whatever creature if the one on the board with Finality happens to die anyway. So very strong card in this deck. And then sometimes you get a surprise casting because of the flashback and buried. So sometimes at the end of your turn before combat, you're going to be like, oh, that's cool. I get to play another Rite of the Moth. I didn't even have to do anything for it. So really cool card there. This deck just really starts to snowball as soon as things get going. And then, as long as you're able to get Ripples of Undeath and keep it on the board, you're going to have a way to just continuously put things in the graveyard. Things like Rakdos, Demolition Field, and Live or Die are going to make sure that are going to be good control against your opponent. There's a reason why Rakdos and Demolition Field are in as many decks as I can put them in, because they're just that good. It's hard to go into a deck without considering Demolition Field. So I think it's just one of the most important cards in the meta right now. All right, I think that covers this deck. So let's get into the final grades. Everyone's favorite time of the video. Let's get into grades. Max hit points, pretty solid. 115 is nothing to sneeze at. Obviously, there are Planeswalkers with more than 115 HP, but for her, it's perfectly fine. I had no issue with it. So get him in a B+. Mana spread. So this is an interesting one, because for a mono black Planeswalker with no way to increase that, this would be not great. It would just be fine. It'd probably be like C for me. But the fact that you can really pump up the black mana bonuses for her is really great. So I have to bump it up a little bit. But, you know, all things taken away, the mana spread would be pretty average to below average if it weren't for that, for a mono Planeswalker at least. So I give it an A- just because you're able to scale up so much, like as much as you're feasibly able to, and it makes sense. So that part of this Planeswalker is super fun to do. So I definitely got to bump it up a bit for that reason. Ability 1. Very cool ability. You know me, I love graveyard recursion, so things that help with that, especially in black, are really interesting and fun for me to dive into. And that's added benefit of being able to convert gems to black with it, especially after you've hit her third ability a few times, really helps to keep the tempo going in your favor. So I gotta give it an A-. Next ability, ability 2, just way too situational to be something you rely on for removal in most cases, and it's just going to be a very niche use to be able to steal your opponent's creatures. I think spells and other abilities will do that a lot better for you, so I would much rather use other abilities than this one. So I'm really giving it a C-. It's just not very effective in most cases. Ability 3, super fun for me. I love the fact that you can scale up her black mana bonuses. To me, that's really up my alley in terms of play style. And then it just opens up so much for you to do. And then you get this board wipe after you've used it enough times. So it's not quite the big bomb that Liliana of the Veil's third ability is, but I think it just makes the game a lot more interesting for you as a player once you've knocked up her mana bonuses enough times to just be able to do all sorts of things with it. But like, you know, dumping out your whole hand onto the board with enough cascades, and then just trying to refill your hand so that you can do it over and over again. So that's totally my idea of fun. And so I'm giving it an S. Just very strong for me. Her passive ability, also great. You know, it takes a little bit of building for it, but, you know, unless you really decide that you don't want to use creatures in mono black, which some people don't. I mean, Liliana of the Veil you don't need creatures for. But in this case, if you're somebody who likes playing creatures and, you know, building them up and using them to beat your opponent with, yeah, this ability lends itself really well to that. And, you know, that surprise bump in mana after you've used your first ability a few times is really cool, and it can really help things get moving along. So I also give this passive an S. It's just really strong for a passive ability. Versatility. So there are only a couple little things that kind of hold her back in terms of versatility, but they're not a super big deal. Certain abilities are a little less effective, like the first ability if you don't have creatures in it. but it's not, going to be a make or break thing for you. It's just, if you're going to be using this Liliana, you're probably going to be using creatures. And then you do want to save room in your deck for loyalty generation. So that's why I think Ripples of Undeath is such a good card to put into this deck if you have it. So make sure to save some crystals for Puzzle Masters 2 where you can get that card from. But other than that, she's just really opened up to a lot of whatever you want to do with her other than that. So I give her versatility an A+. Card utility. Yeah, I think that with her mana bonuses, being able to scale up to however much you can use that third ability, it just means that you can do a lot with high cost cards, other than, needing some card draw in there. Other than that, she kind of just really helps move things along when you've gotten enough loyalty under your belt. So I also think she's very strong with card utility. So I'm giving her an A. And then fun. I really love how fun bumping up her mana bonuses and doing wacky stuff with her is. So I just find her a lot more conducive to my playstyle than something like Liliana of the Veil, which, I grumble about her a lot on Discord and stuff, but she's definitely like a strong planeswalker. But is she stronger than Liliana of the Dark Realms? Probably. I would say so. But would I prefer to use this Liliana over her in most situations? I think so. Because Liliana of the Veil can be a little bit unpredictable in terms of hitting objectives in some cases. So I find her more versatile in that regard and just more fun overall. So I'm giving her an A in fun. So what does that leave us to grade her overall? For me, she is an A walker, just a very solid A. I think if the ability 2 was a little bit stronger or just more useful, it doesn't necessarily have to be an S tier ability, but I mean, if she was, I would just, have to give her an S tier grade. But that kind of knocks her down a bit, and there are just a couple little things here and there that put her just under an S for me. But, an A is a very high recommendation from me. So you're thinking about picking her up. Yeah, I think that you'll really like her. If you feel like the things that I laid out here are up your alley, I think that buying her is a good idea. I think she's going to be a very solid planeswalker to pick up from the vault. It's only going to be like 295 crystals, a little less if you're a VIP member. So if you really can't wait that long and just really want to play around with her, then yeah, definitely spend the cash on her if you're that type of player. Other than that, yeah, I think that she's a worthwhile inclusion in most rosters. Would I recommend her to newer players over Liliana of the Veil? I think that they're about equal in that regard. This Liliana might be a little bit more dependent on card collections to be strong, but I don't know. I feel like Liliana of the Veil, you also want to put some loyalty ramp in her because she relies so much on her loyalty abilities as well. I don't think that this Liliana necessarily does, though they are very strong and pretty much the reason you want to play her. So yeah, she gets a very high recommendation for me. Thank you, Webcore, for letting me use her. I've had a blast with her. I've been playing the hell out of her lately, so I am very satisfied. And I look forward to seeing what new Planeswalkers are coming down the pipeline. Alright, that'll do it for this review. Let me know what you think of her. If you picked her up, do you agree with my assessments? And would you also recommend her to other players who are thinking about it? Alright, see you in the next one.